Tonight we're going to continue in the book of Esther. We're going to look at chapter 6, verse 12, all the way through chapter 7, verse 7. Some fascinating stories in those verses. And a quick review of the book. It all starts with King Xerxes' great banquet. Vashti, the queen, is deposed. And that brings us to the second section, which is the three main characters in the book, Esther, Mordecai, and Haman. And they all have a story to tell. Esther becomes the new queen. Mordecai uncovers a plot that saves King Xerxes' life, but for 5 years it's forgotten. He's never rewarded for that until chapter 6. So 5 years later, the king finally remembers what took place. And then Haman is promoted to a great position. Everybody's supposed to bow down before Haman and love him and respect him and honor him, and everybody does except Mordecai. And Haman finds out that Mordecai is a Jew, and since Haman is an Agagite, an Amalekite, and the Jews and the Amalekites have been fighting for 1,000 years, Haman sees this as a golden opportunity to right the wrongs for 1,000 years and finally get back at the Jewish people. So he convinces the king to put his stamp of approval on an edict that all the Jewish people would be put to death 11 months from the date of the decree. And somehow he talks the king into it. The king doesn't even ask who the people group happens to be, and this edict goes in and becomes law. And that brings us to Esther's courageous decision, because when Mordecai finds out, he's just beside himself. He's in sackcloth and ashes. He's weeping. He's wailing. But he comes up with a plan, and his plan is really simple. Esther's to solve the problem. You know, isn't it great when you come up with a plan and it's somebody else who gets to solve the problem? And Mordecai suggests that since Esther is the queen, maybe she can go before the king and plead for mercy on behalf of the Jewish people. And eventually Esther says, yes, that's exactly what I'm going to do. So she goes before the king accepts her, then the king asks what she wants, and she invites him to lunch. A banquet with Haman. Bring Haman along too. So the three of them have lunch. And it's a wonderful lunch. And the king looks at Esther and says, oh, by the way, what's your petition? What is your request? And Esther says, I'll tell you tomorrow when we have lunch again. So twice Esther had an opportunity to explain, but twice she delays. Well, after Haman has lunch with the king and queen, he's feeling really good about himself. His ego is at its peak. And then he walks home and sees Mordecai. And Mordecai doesn't respect him, honor him, bow down before him, or even acknowledge his presence. And Haman goes ballistic. So he goes home and tells his family about it. And eventually his wife and some friends say, we've got an idea. Why don't you just go before the king, King Xerxes, and tell him that you want Mordecai put to death? He won't obey the law. He won't respect you. He won't honor you. The man deserves to die. And Haman says, that's the best idea I've ever had in my life. So that's where we leave this section. And then the next section is the fact that Mordecai gets honored. This story completely changes when the king can't fall asleep. He has a sleepless night. And eventually the king says to one of his servants, go get the records of my reign and just kind of read them to me. And I don't know if he was thinking that that would put him to sleep, or if he had simply given up on sleep and he wanted to hear some good stuff about himself. But the servant begins to read, and the servant tells the story of Mordecai. How 5 years ago, Mordecai uncovered an assassination plot against the king and saved the king's life. And the king says, did we ever reward Mordecai for his loyalty, for his faithfulness? And the servant says, no, we didn't. And so now the king is thinking, I've got to do something for Mordecai. So it becomes morning, and the king is back on his throne. And Haman comes in bright and early because Haman has a request of the king. And the request is to put Mordecai to death, to execute him. But before Haman can ask the king for anything. The king has a question for Haman. And the king asked Haman, "What should we do for a man that I want to honor?" And Haman is thinking, king wants to honor me. So Haman requests what he would really like. And Haman says, maybe we should put the man in one of the king's robes. Dress him up in royalty. And then let him ride on one of the king's horses. The horse with the crown between his ears, the royal horse. And then let one of the leading officials lead the horse through the streets of Susa, announcing that this is what the king has done for the man that he wants to honor. And Xerxes says, "Wow, I really like that plan. So Haman, why don't you go get the horse, go get the robe, and then put the robe on Mordecai and lead him through the streets." And Haman's going, "I didn't see that one coming." In fact, I didn't like this picture at first. Now I like it more because it's a picture that's worth 1,000 words. Because Mordecai's on the horse, and he should be in purple because that's the king's robe. And there's the horse with the crown on top of his head. And there's Haman walking the horse through the streets, telling everybody that Mordecai is being honored by the king. So instead of Mordecai being executed, he's exalted by the king. And instead of Haman being honored, he's humiliated. Because now, and he hates the Jewish people, he's got to parade this Jewish guy through town, letting everybody know that the king is honoring him. And that brings us to where we're going to pick up tonight. Haman gets rejected. And that's at the end of chapter 6 in verses 12 through 14. So let me read those 3 verses and then we'll talk about them and then jump into the next section. So Esther chapter 6 verse 12. Afterward, Mordecai returned to the king's gate. But Haman rushed home with his head covered in grief and told Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends everything that had happened to him. His advisors and his wife Zeresh said to him, "Since Mordecai, whom your downfall has started, is of Jewish origin, you cannot stand against him. You will surely come to ruin." While they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried Haman away to the banquet Esther had prepared. So this is kind of the aftermath of that morning when Haman leads Mordecai through the streets. And it's interesting that after that event is over, it looks like things just return to normal. Mordecai goes back to work. He's always at the king's gate, so he goes back to his normal position. He goes back to work, and then Haman rushes home. He decides to go home because he's got a story to tell. We're not told how Mordecai felt about being on the horse, wearing the king's robe, and being honored by all the people. The author doesn't tell us how Mordecai felt, but he certainly does tell us how Haman felt. And Haman rushes home with his head covered in grief. Kind of reminds us of how Mordecai felt after he read Haman's edict for the first time, that Mordecai put on sackcloth and ashes, that he went running through the streets weeping and wailing. Mordecai had a funeral for the Jewish people 11 months before anybody died. But on that day, Mordecai grieved for the Jewish people. Haman is now grieving for himself. It's a grief of shame. Here he was, thinking that this day is the day I get rid of Mordecai. And instead of getting rid of Mordecai, he has to honor Mordecai all morning long, walking through the streets of Susa, giving honor and respect to Mordecai. And he goes home shaking his head. How did this ever happen? He's mourning. He's in grief. And then when he arrives home, he tells Zeresh, his wife, and all of his friends everything that happened to him. Now, he thought he was going to come home that day and tell Zeresh and all his friends that Mordecai's dead. My enemy's dead. I triumphed over him. But instead, he has to come home and tell the story that Mordecai has triumphed over him. That he had to be the one to pull the horse through the streets of Susa. It's interesting that his friends are then called his advisors. Sometimes we wonder how many friends Haman really had. Maybe they were more advisors than they were true friends. And it's interesting how quickly they have turned against him. The night before, Zeresh and these friends, these advisors, say to him, "Go to the king and request that Mordecai be executed." They come up with this great plan. But now they say to Haman, "Your downfall has started, and you can't do anything about it. You're going to surely come to ruin." Isn't that what friends are for? They liked him the night before, not today. They basically prophesy over him that, "Haman, you're going to come to ruin. This is the beginning of the end for you." Why? Because you have decided to take on Mordecai, who's a Jewish person. And perhaps these Amalekites were thinking, here we go again. We've read our history. Every time we take on the Jewish people, who wins? The Jewish people. Every time we attack the Israelites, they win the war. We can never seem to defeat them. And Haman, you've taken on a Jewish man. And the writing's on the wall. You're going to lose. The Jewish man is going to win. You're finished, Haman. Wow, that's not what he expected. When you have a bad day and you go home, you expect a little comfort, a little encouragement. But it's like, this is the end of you, buddy. You've chosen the wrong enemy. And this is the beginning of your end. And then while they're still talking, the king's eunuchs arrive and they hurry Haman off to lunch. Lunch, a banquet with the king and queen. And he was looking forward to that. Especially if Mordecai was dead. He could just relax with the king and queen and celebrate life. His enemy is put to death. Everything is good. But not anymore. Now he's going to show up to lunch, having been humiliated by Mordecai all morning long. And then he goes home to his family, his wife and his friends, his advisors, and they tell him that this is the beginning of your end. So he shows up for lunch thinking, now what's going to happen? My life is being turned completely upside down. That brings us to the next section. Esther's second banquet. And she's finally going to have that second banquet. The first banquet was in chapter 5. So it's taken a while. But the next day she's going to have her banquet. And this banquet is going to be all about who gets to live and who gets to die. Both Esther and Haman will beg for their life. Their life is on the line during this banquet. This is more than just a cozy luncheon between three people. Everything is now on the line. And Esther realizes, and Haman will realize, that their life is now caught up in this complicated set of circumstances over which they have no control. Their circumstances have taken on a life of their own, and they're just kind of along for the ride, and they're not sure where their circumstances are going to take them. Esther's destiny lies with her people. And Haman's destiny, it's going to overtake him like a thief in the night, something he never expected to take place. Have you ever found yourself caught up in a series of circumstances over which you have no control? I mean, somebody else is calling the shots, not you. And you're just going to have to hope and pray that things turn out, because there's not a whole lot that you can do. That's where Esther finds herself, and that's where Haman will find himself later in the story. Haman's story is a story of tragedy, and it's an ironic tragedy. He had some really good plans. He had his life all planned out. He had it all arranged. He had it all figured out. He even had, he thought, the power of the empire behind him. But in an instant, his plans get turned upside down, and his destiny is completely reversed. And it all began with something that seemed so insignificant. The king could not sleep one night. And that very fact that the king could not sleep was the beginning of the end for Haman. Isn't it amazing how God can turn things around through something that seems so insignificant? I mean, as we're reading this story, we're thinking, oh no, Mordecai's going to be dead the next day. Then after Mordecai is dead, Esther will go before the king at her banquet. She'll tell the king what she wants, and the king will say, no way. And Mordecai will die, and the Jewish people will die. But because the king has a sleepless night, because God intervenes, Mordecai gets honored the next day. And we'll find out in just a second about how things go with Queen Esther's request of the king. Haman thought he had it all planned out, had his plan, but it didn't work out. Ever been there? You've got things planned out. You're going to do this and you're going to do that, and something happens and everything changes. And it can go either way. I mean, you can wake up thinking, oh, this is going to be a great day. But something happens, and by the end of the day, you're thinking, this was a horrible day. Or you may get up in the morning thinking, oh, I'm really dreading this day. But by the end of the day, something happens, you go, wow, that was a great day. Sometimes we can become the victim of circumstances, which is why we must trust God with our circumstances, because often we can't control our circumstances, but we can trust the God of our circumstances. We never know what a day may bring, and often the unmentioned God will write his own version of the story. And that's what God is doing. I mean, the story was going along, and it looked like Haman was writing the story, and everything was going Haman's way. Then all of a sudden, the king can't sleep, and God changes the entire story. And now Haman's end becomes tragic. Well, let me read verses 1 through 7 of chapter 7, and we'll talk about Esther's second banquet. It begins in chapter 7, verse 1. So the king and Haman went to Queen Esther's banquet. And as they were drinking wine on the second day, the king again asked, Queen Esther, what is your petition? It will be given you. What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted. Then Queen Esther answered, If I have found favor with you, your majesty, and if it pleases you, grant me my life. This is my petition. And spare my people. This is my request. For I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. If we had merely been sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet, because no such distress would justify disturbing the king. King Xerxes asked Queen Esther, "Who is he? Where is he? The man who has dared to do such a thing?" Esther said, "An adversary, an enemy, this vile Haman." Then Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. The king got up in a rage, left his wine, and went out into the palace garden. But Haman, realizing that the king had already decided his fate, stayed behind to beg Queen Esther for his life. Well, what a fascinating story. And it all begins with King Xerxes' question. And his questions have been the same. What is your petition? What is your request? What do you want? When Esther appears before him the first time, she doesn't answer. She invites him to lunch. And then after inviting him to lunch, he asked again, "What do you want?" And she invites him to the second lunch. But she promises at the second lunch, "I'll answer your question." So it begins that the king and Haman went to Queen Esther's banquet. And it's important to recognize that she is the queen. And she's going to be addressed as the queen. And sometimes, if the king really likes his queen, the queen has clout. And that's going to be important, because Esther is going to come before the king and make a request as the queen. And that gives her, if he likes her and is pleased with her, a lot of clout. Well, at the banquet, as they're drinking wine, which was probably the end of the banquet, it was common they'd have their meal, and after the meal they would drink wine and sit around and talk. And finally, the king's going to ask again, "Queen Esther, what is your petition?" And by the way, it'll be given to you. "And what is your request?" Up to half the kingdom, it's going to be granted. The king has remained positive toward Esther the whole time. Perhaps he kind of likes this game. You know, this is the third time he's had to ask. And the first two times, she doesn't really give him an answer. And maybe he likes playing that game, and he's kind of, "Okay, what do you want? Just tell me. I'm going to give it to you. You know, I'm pleased with you. I'm happy with you. So just let me know what you want." He asked two questions, but really the two questions are one question. What is your petition? What is your request? They're one and the same. In other words, what do you want? What do you want me to do for you? And whatever it is, he's willing to do that for her. Well, Esther is finally going to make a response. It's taken her a while, but on her third try, she's finally going to answer the king. Her moment has arrived, but she faces this dilemma. She has to walk a thin line. She wants to accuse Haman, but she also has to keep in mind that the king had given his stamp of approval to this edict. So she has to accuse Haman without also implicating the king. That could be a little tricky. Also, she's got to convince the king that his number one man, his best delegate, his best servant, his best official is guilty and is in the wrong. And she has to do that without making the king angry at her. So this is a delicate situation for the queen. I mean, she's got to accuse Haman, but let the king slide. And then she's got to convince Xerxes that Haman's a bad guy. and he's not his best delegate. Well, how's she going to do that? Well, it begins in verse 3. The queen answers. And she always answers by, you got to butter up the king. You got to honor the king before you give your answer. You can't just blurt it out. So she says, if I have found favor with you, your majesty, and if it pleases you. In other words, king, whatever you do, I want to honor you. I want to bring honor to you. So I'm going to make this request, and I hope that you're willing to answer it so that this answer also brings honor to you, your majesty. And then finally, she comes out and says it. Grant me my life. This is my petition. And spare my people. This is my request. She uses the same language that the king did. Because he asked, what is your petition? Well, it turns out, grant me my life. And what is your request? Spare my people. Now, she gives two answers, but those two answers are really one answer. She identifies with her people. So what happens to her people matters to her. So she wants to live, and she wants her people to live too. So the two things are really one thing. So, King Xerxes, listening to this, that sends a total shockwave into that room. Because Xerxes is thinking, she wants money. She wants land. She wants a certain possession. She wants a certain favor. She wants something material and tangible. And that's why he was so willing to say, whatever you want, I'm just going to give it to you. She doesn't want anything material or tangible. She basically says to the king, my life is in danger, and the lives of my people are in danger too. And the king is going, whoa, whoa, whoa. That can't happen while I'm the king. While I'm the king, nobody kills the queen. If anybody's going to kill the queen, it's going to be me, but I'm not upset with the queen, so nobody's going to kill the queen. And it is my honor to protect the life of my queen. So by protecting Esther, it would bring honor to Xerxes. And remember, this is a culture that's all about honor and shame. So Xerxes is thinking, absolutely. It would bring me great honor to spare your life. I'm not going to let anything happen to you. I'm not going to go down in Persian history as the king who let somebody kill his queen. They would shame me for doing such a thing. I want honor, not shame, so I will absolutely protect you. It's interesting what Esther says and what she doesn't say. She says, spare my people. But she never says who her people are. She's never identified herself as a Jewish woman, and she's never indicated that her people are Jewish. She identifies with her people not in terms of who they are, but their fate. And their fate is they're going to die because somebody wants them dead. A very clever move on her part. The king is now thinking, there is no way I'm going to let anybody kill my queen. So Esther can now move on. For I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. She quotes the edict that Haman wrote back in chapter 3, verse 13. Dispatches were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces with the order to destroy, kill and annihilate all the Jews. She quotes it. And she also knows the background because she says, we have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. But she never indicates who is to blame. Now we know, because we've read the story, who did the selling? Well, it was Haman. And he wants the Jewish people destroyed. However, Haman did not act alone and could not act alone. Haman promises the king 10,000 talents of silver to be placed in the king's royal treasury if he goes along with the edict. It was the king who sold out the Jewish people without even asking what people group Haman was talking about. Xerxes was thinking, 10,000 talents of silver? Sure, I don't care who you kill. Give me the money. The plan was to plunder the Jewish people and take their money and their belongings, their possessions, which Haman would guess would add up to about 10,000 talents of silver. So, a very clever thing. She doesn't indicate who's to blame, but she tells the story, and the king is now thinking, there is no way I'm going to let anybody pull that off. The king doesn't even realize that he's partially to blame for the whole thing. But the king is beginning to get angry at whoever this is, and that will be evident in his next question. It's a very clever way of persuasion. And it's not the first time in the Bible that something like this has happened. King David commits adultery with Bathsheba and does a brilliant job of covering it up because nobody knows except God. And God decides to tell Nathan the prophet what the king has done. And then God tells Nathan the prophet, you need to go confront the king about his sin. And Nathan the prophet's probably thinking, oh yeah, I'm going to go up to the king, accuse him of adultery and murder, and he's going to know that I know what he did, and by the end of the day, I'm not going to have my head attached to my body, because the king is going to kill me. So Nathan the prophet begins to think, I've got to be very sly and very clever in what I tell the king. So Nathan shows up and tells the king a story. It's a story about a rich man and a poor man. The rich man has sheep galore. He has so many sheep he can't even count them. And he also has other animals. I mean, he's just filthy rich. There's this poor man. He's got one sheep, a female sheep. And this poor man loves that sheep. I mean, the sheep has become a member of the family. Well, one day, the rich man has a guest, a traveler. And, doing the hospitable thing, he should fix the traveler a meal. So he decides to serve lamb. And where does he get the sheep? He takes the sheep from the poor man and serves that sheep up as dinner to the traveling guest. And David hears the story and goes ballistic. That rich man deserves to die. Just tell me, Nathan, who is that rich man, and I'll make sure he's dead. And Nathan looked David in the eye and said, you are the man. Nathan got David angry at what had happened before he told him who the guilty party was. Queen Esther does the same. King Xerxes is thinking, there's no way anybody's killing my queen. So just tell me who the guilty party was and I'll get rid of him. So, he's going to ask in verse 5. And it says, King Xerxes asked Queen Esther. And that's the NIV's translation, and it's a good translation. But here's what the original Hebrew literally says. It says, King Xerxes said to Queen Esther. The word say or said is used twice. And it's almost as if Xerxes says, Queen, and then he pauses. Because he knows he has to ask the question, but he doesn't want to ask the question. Because the king just might have a hunch who the guilty party is. And he doesn't want to know it. So in essence, maybe the king is saying, Queen Esther, tell me who it is, but please don't tell me it's Haman. Because I've got this hunch that it's Haman. So he asks her and then stops, noting his hesitation and the seriousness of the question. And then he asked, who is he? Where is he? The man who has dared to do such a thing. And at that point, the queen has won the argument. The king is angry at whoever's guilty. He doesn't know yet who's guilty, but he's angry at whoever is guilty. The king has to ask that question because he may have a hunch who it is, but he doesn't know for sure who it is. And living up to his reputation, King Xerxes doesn't know a lot of things. In fact, we, as the reader, know more than the characters know, which always makes it fun when we're reading the story. Xerxes doesn't know that Esther is Jewish. He's been married to her for at least 5 years, but has no clue that she's Jewish. In fact, Xerxes knows that Mordecai is Jewish, but Xerxes doesn't know that Haman's decree is against the Jewish people. Because if he did, he may have already solved this problem. Because in chapter 6, King Xerxes identifies Mordecai as the Jew. So he knows he's Jewish. But he never asks Haman, who are the people you want to annihilate? Who are these terrible people who break Persian law that you want to get rid of? He never asks the question. So he doesn't know that his own queen is Jewish, and he doesn't know that Haman's decree is against the Jewish people. So he doesn't know that the queen's life is being threatened by the decree that Haman has written. But his honor is offended that somebody would dare do such a thing. So he asks the question, who is it? Now, what the writer doesn't tell us is what Haman is thinking through this whole thing, because he's there. He's overhearing this conversation. You know, that somebody's going to try to kill the queen. And then the queen quotes his edict. Don't know how good his memory is, but he wrote it. And if he remembers it from 5 years ago, he may be thinking, oh no, I think she's talking about me. And Haman doesn't know that Esther's Jewish. He doesn't know either. He's never connected the dots between Mordecai and Esther. Now, Haman can't stand Mordecai, but he has no idea that she's related, that he's related to Queen Esther. But overhearing this, he may be thinking, you've got to be kidding. Esther's Jewish? I just came up with this decree like a month ago to get rid of all the Jewish people, and that would include the queen? I didn't know. Well, Esther knows about Xerxes and Haman. She knows they're close. She knows that Haman is the king's right-hand man, number one official. And she's probably heard about all the times they've hung out together. But that doesn't stop her from what she's about to say. The king wants to know who is he and where is he, and she's going to tell him in no uncertain terms. She doesn't mince words at this point. Who is he? He's an adversary and an enemy. Like, whoa. And where is he? This vile Haman is the man. Maybe she points at him. Maybe she gestures in his direction. Maybe she looks him straight in the eye. But she says, Haman, the guy at the table, is the man. Whoa. Haman is the enemy. And Esther's able to say, Haman is my enemy. He wants to get rid of me. He's got an edict to do so. Oh, and by the way, Haman is also the king's enemy. Haman wants to kill the king's wife and queen. So, Xerxes, Haman's your enemy, not your right-hand man. And Haman is everybody's enemy. Why would he do such a thing to people? Queen Esther has put King Xerxes in a position where he must choose. Do I choose my right-hand man, Haman, or do I choose my queen? And this time, the author tells us how Haman is feeling. He's terrified. He knows that the tables have been turned. Oh, it used to be Xerxes and Haman hanging out for lunch, enjoying a few glasses of wine together. It used to be that Haman could walk into the king's inner court at any hour of the day without an invitation and walk right into the king, and the king would say, Haman, come on in. What's on your mind? But now, the king is going to side with his queen. The king is not going to let anything happen to his queen. And Haman realizes, I'm in deep trouble. So, it ends with the king gets up in a rage. He's absolutely angry. He leaves his wine and goes out to the palace garden. And perhaps the king is thinking, why didn't I keep a closer eye on Haman? Why did I give him so much authority? Why didn't I ask him who he wanted to get rid of in his edict? How did I just get tricked into having my own queen put to death? Wow. How did I ever allow this to happen? And not only that, I approved that edict. So how am I going to punish Haman for something that I approved myself? The king is angry. He leaves the room. He needs time to think. Maybe he needs time to put 2 and 2 together and come up with 4 for the first time in a long time. So he leaves. Haman, realizing that the king had already decided his fate, he probably looked at the king's face and said, I'm not going out there. It's not going to do me any good. Instead, I'm going to take my chances and beg the queen for my life. And maybe he said, Esther, you're Jewish? I never knew. Oh, Esther, if I knew you were Jewish, I would have never made that edict. Oh, queen, I would never do anything to harm you. Beg for mercy for me before the king. Haman's having a bad day. He gets up in the morning thinking he's going to put Mordecai to death. Instead, he parades Mordecai through the streets of Susa, proclaiming that Mordecai is being honored by the king, and Haman is humiliated. And now, after what he thought was just going to be a relaxing lunch, he now finds himself bowing before the queen and begging for his life. Oh, by the way, the man he paraded through the streets was Jewish. And the woman he's now bowing before is also Jewish. All Haman wanted was Mordecai to bow down before him. But now he finds himself bowing down before a Jewish woman, pleading for his life. Haman had no idea what that day would have brought. If he did, he'd have just stayed in bed. We don't know what a day will bring, but we do know who brings the day, which is why we need to trust God every minute and every second of every day. Because we never know when we're going to find ourselves in the middle of some circumstances that we have no control over. And we're just needing to pray that God, who's bigger than our circumstances, will intervene however He chooses and rescue us, save us. He did it for Mordecai. He did it for Queen Esther. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for this incredible story. And thank you, it just takes one moment of intervention from you to flip the story. The story was so bad for Mordecai and for Esther until you intervened, and then everything turned out great for the two of them. And Father, we know in our own lives, as we look at our circumstances, many times we may think, oh, this does not look good. This is looking pretty bad for me. But when you intervene, you flip the circumstances and go, wow, look what God did. You know, I thought this story was going to end so badly, but it ended so well for me because God intervened on my behalf. Father, hear our prayers. Father, when we cry out to you, thank you that you hear us. And thank you that you have a plan. And thank you that you can write your own version of our story. We may think we know how it's going to turn out, but you have the ability to write a new version of that story. And we pray that you will. In Jesus' name, amen.